Have you ever felt like you were trying to canoe uphill? Or have you ever felt like things were harder than you thought they would be or that they should be? A couple weeks ago, I read a story about two guys that I'm certain that you've heard of. Their names are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, but we know them as Lewis and Clark. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned them to explore what was then called the Louisiana Purchase in hopes of finding a water passageway that would connect the Pacific Ocean to the Mississippi River. Jefferson was sure that if they could find this passageway, that would open up all kinds of economic opportunities for the growing nation. If you know anything about their story, then you know it was a grueling journey for Lewis and Clark and the men that were with them, known as the Corps of Discovery. It was just one really setback after another. Unrelenting heat in the day, freezing temperatures at night, swarmed by mosquitoes, grizzly bear attacks, Indian attacks, sickness, untimely deaths. I mean, it was just one thing after another. There was one setback, though, that they experienced that they never could have imagined. It happened in a place near Idaho when Lewis got up early one morning and he and a small scouting party went ahead of the rest of the group, and they were trying to find the source of the Missouri River. Now, if I could show you this on a map, the Missouri River eventually flows into the Mississippi River, and he was certain that if they could find the source of the Missouri River, all they would have to do is put their canoes in the water and sail to the Pacific Ocean. They thought they were close, so they got up early one morning, went ahead of the rest of the group, and they came to a small hill that sort of stood in their way. And for Lewis, this was the moment that he had waited his entire life for. He was convinced that all they had to do was climb this small hill, go down the gentle slope on the other side, and what they would find would be a gentle stream leading to the Missouri River, which would then in turn lead to the Pacific Ocean. And he was convinced all they had to do was carry their canoes over this hill, go down the other side, put their canoes, and then sail into the history books. But that's not what happened. Instead, what they discovered was that what lay on the other side of that hill was not a gentle stream flowing lazily toward the ocean. Instead, what they saw was the Rocky Mountains. I've got a picture that I want to show you that would have been taken near where all of this occurred. And this is very similar to the view that Meriwether Lewis saw the morning he climbed over what he thought the hill that was going to lead them into the history books. One historian called this the moment that the geography of hope gave way to the geography of reality. I want you to listen to the way Lewis described this moment in his journal. He said, after refreshing ourselves, we proceeded on to the top of the dividing ridge, from which I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow. Can you imagine what that moment must have been like? You're convinced this is the moment you've spent your life waiting for, only to see what seems like an insurmountable obstacle standing in your way. One historian described that moment saying this: as he stepped off the map into uncharted territory, Lewis discovered that what was in front of him was nothing like what was behind him, and that what had brought him to this point in the journey would take him no further. Lewis faced a daunting decision. What would he do now? Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery were looking for a water route, but had run out of water. How do you canoe over mountains? And the answer is that you don't. I don't know how it's been for you, but over the last few months, there have been some days, not every day, but there have been some days when it felt like I was trying to canoe over some mountains. And you've probably had some experiences like that in your own life. Some of you have faced obstacles over the last few months that you could have never imagined. There are things that have happened and challenges that have emerged that you never saw coming. And if you're honest, you probably had some moments when the geography of hope gave way to the geography of reality. And now all of us are coming to this point where we look off into the future and we realize that it's very possible that what's in front of us doesn't look much like what's behind us. As a church, we've experienced some of those same moments. Since the start of the year, we've been in this series that we're calling The Story of Us. We've been working our way through the book of Acts. So if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to Acts chapter 28. It's the last book, the last chapter in the book. Last weekend, if you were here, we left off at the end of Acts 16, where Paul had just left the city of Philippi, where he'd helped to start a church that met in the home of a businesswoman named Lydia. And from the end of Acts chapter 16 to the beginning of Acts chapter 20, Paul goes back to doing what he always does. He travels the world, he trains leaders, he starts churches. But then you get to Acts chapter 21, and he does something where the story changes. He goes back to Jerusalem. Now, keep in mind, he's been gone now for a period of years, and it's the first time he's returned to the place where all of this started. And it's at that point in Acts 21 that the story gets just a little bit crazy. 7 days after arriving back in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, which was like the Jewish Supreme Court, arrests Paul, and they have him placed in jail. And then while they have him in custody, the leaders of the Sanhedrin put together this conspiracy to have him murdered. Now, the Romans hear what's happening. They know the Jews have had it out for Paul for all these years that he's been gone. They've been waiting for their opportunity, and now they've seized that moment to try and eliminate him. But the Romans understand what's happening, so they have Paul transferred from the jail there in Jerusalem to a place called Caesarea, where he'll stand trial not before the Sanhedrin, not before the religious court, but before the civil court, which is under the authority of a governor named Felix. Acts 22 tells us that for 2 years, Paul remains in prison while he waits for his trial. But then all of a sudden, Felix, this civil governor, he dies unexpectedly, and a new governor comes into power named Festus. When we had our twins last year, I was pushing for the names Felix and Festus. But for some reason, that never took off, probably for good reason. Anyways, Felix is gone. Festus is now the governor, and nobody knows what to do with Paul. So Paul finally plays the last card that he has in his arsenal, and he appeals to Caesar. Now, because he was a Roman citizen, every Roman citizen had the right to have their case heard by the emperor himself. He was the final authority in the empire. So Paul appeals to Caesar. Now, here's where it gets even crazier. Acts 27, they take Paul out of jail. They put him on a boat, and they're going to sail towards Rome. He's going to be transported to Rome, where he'll stand trial before the emperor. And there's one verse there in Acts 27 that I want to show you on the screen in which Luke describes their journey. Here's what it says. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. You ever felt like the wind was against you? You ever felt like everything in your life was sort of conspiring to slow you down and hold you back and stop your progress? You know, as a church, we're living now in a time in which it sometimes feels like the wind is against us. And it wasn't always like that. Some of you remember it really wasn't that long ago when nobody would schedule something on a Sunday because they knew if they did, nobody would come because Sunday was a day reserved for worship. And it wasn't that long ago, even in our culture, where if you didn't go to church or if you just happened to miss a service at your church, you could anticipate that before your lunch was finished, the phone was going to ring because it was just sort of expected that everybody would be there every time the doors were open. Some of you can remember a time, and this has not been that long ago either, when even the people who didn't go to church and didn't agree with the church's message at least admired our values and respected what we were trying to do. But today, it's not that way. Rather than having the wind at our back and things working with us, now it seems that almost everything is working against us. I have a map that I want to show you. I hope you can see this. A couple verses after noting that the wind was against them, Luke tells us that they made really slow progress from Jerusalem to Rome. And if you can see the map, you see that the route they took was anything but a straight line. I mean, there was all sorts of detours as they tried to avoid the wind. They couldn't get where they wanted to go, so they had to go out of their way, and because of that, it slowed them down. It was anything but a straight line. It was anything but the fastest possible route. But you know what? That's usually the way it works. I mean, rarely is it a straight line from where you are to where you hope to be. Usually there's a lot of detours that slow down your progress. I was thinking back over our shared experience here last couple years, and it's hard to remember, but 2019 was really an incredible year. In fact, if you went back through all of the years, the history of First Christian, it'd be hard to find a year that was better than 2019. The building project was completed a few months into the year. Christian Standard, which is kind of like our a magazine of our group of churches, calls, and they do this big article about our kids ministry, which was really cool. Then a few months later, they call back and they say, hey, we did the calculations, and as it turns out, you guys had the fourth most baptisms in the nation for churches your size. You think, boy, that's really cool. And then 2019 sort of comes to the end. 2020 is emerging. You think 2020 is going to be the year. This is going to be the year where we really move forward. And then what happened is literally almost overnight, there's a shift in the wind. And all of a sudden, the wind is no longer at your back pushing you forward. Now the wind is against you. And no longer are you on this straight line from where you are to where you think you need to go. Now you're confronted with a series of detours that slow your progress. And the scary part is nobody's sure what's around the next corner. That's the same situation the Apostle Paul found himself in. You get to verse 13 of Acts 27, and it says the wind becomes this violent storm that threatens to capsize the boat. Luke tells us the storm was so powerful they had to drop their anchor. They throw all their supplies, including all of their food, overboard in hopes of lightening the ship so they can steady the ship. And after several days of enduring this incredibly powerful storm, at the end of verse 20, Luke uses this line. He says, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They're in this situation where they're not sure things are ever going to get better, and they lose hope. So it's at that point that Paul stands up, and he's beaten, and he's hungry, and he's scared, but he stands up and he encourages the other guys. He says, hey, don't lose hope because the Lord has spoken to me, and we're all going to survive the storm. And if you know the story, you know they do survive the storm. And it's at that point in the story, if this were a movie, you would think, okay, that's sort of the challenge. Now things are going to get better. The storm clouds lift. The storm dissipates. The sun is shining. The wind is not blowing. And it feels like it's a new day. But then all of a sudden, things go from bad to worse. And rather than going into this period of smooth sailing, they experience a shipwreck in which they hit this sandbar in shallow water. And Luke tells us they hit this sandbar so hard with such force that the stern of the ship literally broke into pieces. And it feels like everybody's going to drown in this icy water. But somehow they all pick up these busted planks and they survive for a few hours in the water, and everybody makes it to shore. Now they've been in this water, this icy water. They're near hypothermia. So what's the first thing they do? They get on this island that's called Malta, and thankfully the islanders accept them rather than immediately killing them, which was always an option in the ancient world. But they invite them up there, and they build these huge fires. And it says that Paul reaches down to pick up a piece of brushwood to put on the fire, and what happens is a poisonous snake grabs his hand and latches into his hand. And it says at that point, the islanders looked at him and they made the assumption that Paul was cursed. And if you're like me, you think maybe Paul thought he was cursed too. 2 years in prison, transported to Rome. He goes through a violent storm, a shipwreck, and now he's got a poisonous snake that's hanging out of his hand. And you have to wonder if he thought, man, this is not what I signed up for. He had to think, man, this feels kind of like we're canoeing uphill. This is not what we expected. But there's a lesson there that I don't want you to miss, and it's a hard truth that all of us need to be reminded of. It says the setbacks are always part of the story. It's never a straight line from where you are to where you think God wants you to be. The setbacks are just part of it. John 16, Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. And the reason he said that is because he wanted us to know that even when we're in a relationship with him, the setbacks are part of the story. There's just no way around it. And the thing about setbacks is that they can come in a lot of different forms. Sometimes they come in the form of a bad diagnosis. You go for your yearly checkup, you feel great, you think everything's good, and the doctor comes in and says, hey, we've seen something that worries us. Sometimes the setbacks come in the form of a big deal that fell through, or a promotion that you don't get, or a relationship that falls apart, or an unexpected bill that you weren't counting on, or the unexpected death of somebody that you love. Sometimes they come in the form of a virus that shuts down your business, forces your kids to go to school on the internet, and stalls your church's progress. The other thing about setbacks is that not only do they come in different forms, sometimes they come one right after the other. Some of you experience that. You climb over one mountain and you're ready for smooth sailing and clear skies, and the next thing you see is not just one mountain, it's a whole range of mountains. And every time you climb over one, you look at the next one, and it's bigger, and it's a little bit steeper than the one you just climbed over. And unless you already know that the setbacks are part of the story, that can paralyze you. That's one of the cool things about Paul's story, is that he never allowed the setbacks, as dramatic as they were, he never allowed them to paralyze him. They sometimes slowed him down, but they never stopped him. In verse 11 of Acts 28, Luke tells us that after spending 3 months on the island of Malta, they get back in the water, they get back on a boat, and they complete their journey to Rome. You get to verse 16, they finally arrive. Here's what it says. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. Now, you know, in the ancient world, communication over long distances, very difficult, even between continents. So what happens is, even though the journey to Rome took longer than Paul anticipated, the charges against him have not yet arrived. So he arrives there, and nobody knows what to do with him. All they know is that he's some sort of a troublemaker. So here's what they do. They put him on house arrest. Now, you know, today, if you're on house arrest, we've got ankle monitors, and some of you have experienced that. You know, no, well, maybe. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You got these ankle monitors. If you leave your house, it alerts the police, and you're in big trouble. But in those days, they didn't have that. So here's what they did. They would take a guard, a Roman soldier, and they would put a chain, like a handcuff, with a long chain on his wrist, and then the other end of that chain would be chained to the prisoner. So 24 hours a day, Paul is chained at the wrist to a Roman guard. And every 4 hours, they would have this shift change. They'd come in, the old one would leave, a new guy would come. And, you know, think about that, 24 hours a day, there had to be some pretty awkward moments. But at least Paul had somebody to talk to. Long and grueling journey, Paul finally arrives in this city that literally controlled the world. I mean, whatever happened in Rome would reverberate throughout the empire. The problem for him, though, is that he has no idea how all of this is going to turn out. It's very possible that the charges never arrive. Nobody knows what to charge him with, so eventually they let him go. Or it could be that the emperor doesn't like the looks of him and decides to chop off his head. He has no idea how it's going to go. All he knows is that he's there and he's waiting for what's next. As a church, we find ourselves in a very similar situation over the last few months. And you've seen this in the world in general, and especially in the church world. There have been all of these predictions, countless predictions in which experts have told us exactly what the future is going to look like. And so far, nobody's been right about hardly anything. In the church world, these guys have been saying for months, hey, when all of this is over and the virus disappears and everything gets back to normal, people are going to flood back to church because they're going to be so hungry for an in-person worship experience that they're just going to knock the door down. But now, the longer this drags on, the more those same people are saying, hey, there's going to be a percentage of people that were once active in your church that are never going to come back. And you need to be prepared for that. George Barna is a researcher, put out a study a few weeks ago, said that 1 out of every 5 active church members, listen to this, 1 out of every 5 active church members has not attended an in-person worship service or even watched one online since March of last year. You say, well, 20% is not that bad, but in a church our size, that's almost 80 people just sort of disengaged. And you have to wonder, what's going to happen? And the scary thing, or maybe the frustrating thing, and you've experienced this, and it's not everybody, so please don't misunderstand, but the frustrating thing is that I guarantee you, if you go to a ball game or you go to a restaurant, see the same people. And you wonder, are they ever coming back? And the answer is, nobody knows. What do you do when the future's uncertain? What do you do when you're waiting for the next chapter to reveal itself? There are 3 things that Paul does once he arrived in Rome that serve as a a pretty good model for us as we try to prepare for whatever comes next, whether it's up or down, good or bad. There are three things we have to continue to do. Here's the first thing. We have to continue to initiate conversations. Check out verse 17. It says, 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this shame." So you think he's been on this incredible journey, the shipwreck, the storm, the snake bite. He's trying to recover, and he gets there, and 3 days later, rather than taking time to recover, he invites the Jewish leaders in Rome over to where he's staying. He can't go to them, but he invites them to come over to him. And it looks like on the surface of it that he's just sort of pumping them for information. But you get down to verse 20, and he tells you what it's really about. He's talking to them about the hope of Israel. This whole conversation is just a cover for him to talk to them about the hope of Israel. And one of the things you learn about Paul as you read through Acts is that he was an expert at finding this common ground that he could use to initiate conversations. The problem with us, though, is that sometimes we make this too complicated. And a lot of us make this too awkward. Let me give you a helpful hint, okay? If you're talking to somebody about church and about Jesus, and you kind of get this weird look in your eye, and your voice starts to change. I mean, if you talk to somebody and you come up to them and you're like, "Did you go to church this Sunday?" You're not helping, all right? You're scaring people. I mean, if you're trying to sound like Billy Graham and James Earl Jones, and you've got this intense stare in which they're not sure you're going to talk to them or try to rip their head off, just don't do that. All you really have to do is just be yourself. Just talk like you normally talk. See, every conversation, man, there are these hinges that you can use to turn the conversation where you want it to go if you learn to listen for the hinges. So sometimes it's as simple as this. You go into work tomorrow and somebody's going to say, "Hey, how was your weekend?" It's a common question. You probably get asked that tomorrow before lunch. So you answer the question, "Hey, Friday was awesome. Watched a movie with my kids. Then on Saturday, we watched Kentucky. We finally won a game, which was cool. Then Sunday, hey, we all got up and went to church, and the preacher talked about writing the next chapter, and it was really helpful." That's all you've done. You haven't said anything weird. You haven't changed your voice. You haven't bulked up like you're going to fight somebody. You just answered the question, but you've turned the conversation. Or you can learn to do what Andy Stanley talks about. You listen for the 3 knots. This is so important. I'll put this on the screen because I want you to see this. Anytime you hear somebody say they're not prepared for something, they're not in church, or something's not going well, that's an open door. That's like a crack in the door that you can use to step through. And if you learn to listen, you'll hear people say things like, "You know what? This thing, whatever it is, this surgery is getting ready to happen. This event is getting ready to happen. This job change is getting ready to happen. And I'm not sure I'm prepared for it." Open door. Somebody comes in and says, "This weekend I just realized my kids don't listen to me at all. There's a huge disconnect between me and my kids. It's just not going well." Open door. Or somebody comes back to what you said. "Hey, you mentioned that you went to church this week. It's been years since I've been into church." Open door. And you haven't freaked anybody out. And you haven't acted like a crazy person. You just step through the door when it opens. But if you never seize the moment, you never have the conversation. Here's the second thing. As you prepare for this next chapter, we have to continue to share the gospel boldly. Paul initiates this conversation. You get to verse 21, it says, the Jewish leaders are so interested in what he has to say that they come back a second time, and the second time they come back, they bring more people with them. Check this out, verse 21. They replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day, and they came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. He witnessed to them from morning till evening, explaining about the kingdom of God, and from the law of Moses and from the prophets, he tried to persuade them about Jesus. Some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. What Paul is doing here, he's using this combination of private conversations coupled together with public proclamation to try and help connect the dots for his listeners. It's the same thing we try to do today. Every week, when our team sits down to plan the weekend service, we're thinking about how can we connect the dots. Now, does that mean that every question will be answered? No. Are we going to cover every topic every weekend? No, but we're trying to connect the dots for people so over a long period of time they get the answers that they're looking for. That means that every song we sing, every video we show, every communion message, every message we share, all of that is meant to connect the dots. Now, it doesn't always work, and sometimes, we do a better job than other times, but that's always the goal. When people come to a worship service or when they watch one online, our goal is to help them connect the dots and move them a little closer to Jesus. But there's another piece to Paul's strategy here that we sometimes forget about, and it's probably the most important. It's those private conversations that take place not inside of a church building, but they take place across the table at a restaurant. They take place in the stands at a ball game. They take place in your car when you're driving around with the people that you hang out with. They take place in your classroom when the kids have gone home. They take place in the break room at your job. It's those private conversations. And the way it's designed is that those private conversations are supposed to lead to opportunities for public proclamation. That's how you connect the dots. It's a combination of both. But here's the kicker. If you never have any of those private conversations, then the public proclamation never gets heard. So another way to say it would be that what we're trying to do on Sundays and on the weekend is not nearly as effective if you're not having those conversations Monday through Saturday. Now keep in mind that when you do this, there'll be some people who get it and some people who don't. Verse 24 says, hey, some of them were convinced, and Paul was a lot more convincing than we'll ever be. Some of them were convinced, but others would not believe. Sometimes you'll try to have these conversations. You'll hear those three knots. You'll try to hinge point that conversation to the place you want it to go. And sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes people will accept what you're saying. Sometimes it'll just bounce off of them. But it doesn't matter. That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to have the conversations. That's why the third thing is so important. Really what this whole time has been about. For us as a church and for you as an individual follower of Jesus, the key thing in the future is to stay focused on the mission. It's what it's always been about, what it'll always be about. You get down to verse 25, and Paul, being the master at connecting with his audience that he was, takes them back to the Old Testament that they loved so much to remind them of something that they didn't like nearly as much. Check out the way he does this. They disagreed among themselves, and they began to leave after Paul had made this final statement. The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors when he said through Isaiah the prophet, go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They can hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. From the very first day of the church's existence, the mission of the church has been to reach people who are far from God with the message of the gospel. That's our calling. Before we do anything, we should always be asking the question, how does this help us reach people who are far from God? See, the problem the Jewish leaders made is they assumed that because they were in the family, that it was about them. They assumed that the family was about the people who were already a part of the family. And they forgot that the reason Jesus came was to invite people who are outside the family to come into the family. It was never meant to be inward focused. It was always focused on reaching people who are outside the circle. And yet somehow we keep forgetting that. So the question is, will it be hard? Yes. Will there be moments when you're disappointed? Yes. Will there be moments when it feels like you're trying to canoe uphill and climb over mountains? And the answer is yes. But will it be worth it? Yes. At the end of Acts 28, it kind of feels like Luke leaves you hanging. It's kind of an abrupt ending. He never tells you how the trial turns out. Just to give you a spoiler, most scholars agree that Paul was released from this imprisonment somewhere around 63 A.D. Then he spent the next 4 years, went right back to what kept getting him in trouble. He planted churches and trained leaders and traveled around the world before 67 A.D. He was arrested again, brought back to Rome, and this time he was beheaded at the direction of the Roman Emperor Nero. But Luke doesn't tell us all. He just sort of lets it hang out there. He says, hey, Paul's in Rome. He's awaiting trial, and he doesn't know how it's going to turn out. So what's he going to do next? Check this out, verse 30. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house, and he welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. 2 years. He sits in the house and he waits for what's next. But he doesn't just wait. He uses that uninterrupted time to initiate a whole lot of conversations and to share the gospel boldly. What do you do when you're not sure what the next chapter is going to look like? What do you do when you're not sure what's coming around the next corner? As a church, we find ourselves in a position in which we're not sure what next week is going to look like, much less the next few months or next few years. It could be that maybe, this all dissipates and people come back and we come back stronger than ever. It could be that a lot of people never come back and it feels like we're starting over. I have no idea how it's all going to turn out, but I do know this. For us to write a better story, for us to create the future that we want to experience, we're going to have to initiate some conversations and stay focused on our mission. I got a picture I want to show you. This is really cool. One of the reasons that we know so much about the expeditions of Lewis and Clark is that both Meriwether Lewis and William Clark kept just detailed journals. Day after day, wherever they paused for that night in their journey, they would pull out these papers and they would keep a detailed log of where they were, what they were learning, what they were experiencing, who was sick, what had happened. And if you read through it, it's really interesting to read. This is actually a sample page from the journal of Captain William Clark. 28 months on the journey from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. At the end of every day, he would give this log of where they were, what they learned. You can see sketched out a map at the bottom of one of those pages. You go through, you'll see vocabulary list of words that they had picked up as they encountered different Indian tribes. On some pages, he would even make these little sketches of different species that they had encountered on their journey that you didn't see in other parts. There's all sorts of drawings of birds and reptiles and things that just caught their eye. And every day they would do it. For 1,123 days, they pulled out the pen and he would tell us, here's where we are, here's what we draw out, anything he needed to draw. And then right at the end of almost every page, 99% of those 1,123 pages, whatever it is, right at the end of almost every page, virtually every entry ends with the same 3 words. There's one refrain, 3 words that he just puts in over and over and over again. So he'd go through the day and he'd say, hey, we were attacked by Indians today, and here's who got hurt. The next day, hey, there's sickness that's gone through the Corps of Discovery, and people are falling out right and left. Hey, we're freezing to death out here in the wilderness. Hey, the heat is just overwhelming us. We're starving. We're dehydrated. Everybody's sick. The Indians or the grizzly bears have attacked and 2 people got killed. I mean, every day it would just be this litany of everything that had gone wrong. And then at the bottom of the page, the 3-word refrain, we proceeded on. Every day. Hey, some of us got killed. We kept going. Hey, all of us are sick. We proceeded on. Hey, the Indians are waiting to attack us. We proceeded on. Hey, we're not sure where we're going. We proceeded on. Every single day. What do you do when you're not sure what the future looks like? What do you do when it feels like you're trying to canoe uphill? You keep going. That's it. You just keep going. If you were to write the history of our church and this community, 190 years, you could summarize it with 3 words. We proceeded on. Wars, world wars, ups, downs, depressions, recessions, contentious elections, transitions, good days, bad days, periods of growth, periods of decline, times of unity, times of disagreement. You just keep going. And even when what's in front of you doesn't look like what's behind you, you just keep going. I want you to stand. We're going to have just a brief invitation. And if you're here this morning and you're ready to go with us, I want you to know that we need you. We need everybody who calls FCC home pulling in the same direction. We have a mission given from God, things that we've been called to do to reach this community. If you're here and you've never officially joined the team, we'd love to have you. We had a guy join last Sunday. If you're here and you've never taken the first step in your journey, meaning you've never put your trust in Christ, never been baptized into Him, David and I would love to walk you through that. All you need to do is come up. We'll be here on these first few rows. You can come talk to us. You can grab us.